When a billionaire rushed home in the middle of a snowstorm, he didn't expect to find his mother freezing, in the arms of a homeless boy. What happened next would change everything he thought he knew about love, money, and what it really means to have a home. The snow was still falling when the Mercedes rolled to a stop in front of the Hartwell estate. It was 5:47 a.m., the hour when even the city seemed to hold its breath. The world outside was frozen, silent, buried under a thick white sheet that blurred the familiar outlines of his 12,000-square-foot mansion. William Hartwell's hands gripped the leather steering wheel, knuckles white. The heated seats did nothing to melt the chill that had settled deep inside him. He'd cut the California conference short, catching the red-eye home after hearing the tremor in his mother's voice over the phone. The way she'd called him Richard again. His father's name. The voice of Alzheimer's, stealing her piece by piece. Now the storm whispered against the windshield like static from another world. The main gate loomed ahead, the iron bars glistening with frost. He pressed the remote. The heavy gates swung open with mechanical precision, just as they always did, security systems, sensors, comfort built on control. But as he eased the car forward, a flash of red caught his eye. The smaller pedestrian gate to the side hung slightly ajar, its digital lock blinking in a pattern he'd never seen before. Malfunctioning. Open. Impossible. He frowned, cutting the engine. For a moment, only the hum of the snow filled the silence. Then he saw movement by the stone column of the portico. Something, or someone, slumped against it. William stepped out, the wind biting through his wool coat. The beam of his headlight stretched across the driveway, slicing through the storm. And then his breath caught. His mother was there. Eleanor Hartwell. 78 years old. Barefoot in the snow. Her thin nightgown fluttering in the wind, blue with tiny flowers she'd worn since his father died. Her silver hair wild and tangled, framing a face gone gray with cold. But she wasn't alone. A young man knelt beside her, his arms wrapped around her frail body like a shield. He couldn't have been older than 20. His skin was dark, his frame thin to the point of pain, the fabric of his sweater worn through so badly that William could see his ribs. The boy's body curved protectively around Eleanor's, their breath mingling in faint clouds of steam. For a single disorienting moment, William didn't know who was saving whom. The billionaire and his mother, icons of wealth, of security, and this stranger, this boy with nothing, holding her as if the world might shatter if he let go. William's pulse thundered in his ears. He stumbled forward, knees slipping on the ice. Mom! Oh my God, Mom! The words tore from him before he realized he was shouting. The boy's eyes flickered open, brown and bloodshot, barely focusing. His lips were blue, his skin pale under the dark tone. He tried to speak, voice cracking like breaking glass. She was lost, he whispered. I couldn't leave her. Then his head dropped forward. William caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him gently to the steps, his other hand reaching for his mother's icy wrist. A faint pulse. Alive. But fading fast. The cold cut deeper than he had ever imagined. He shouted for help, for anyone, though the nearest neighbor was half a mile away. The snow swallowed his voice. In that instant, standing between his mother and a dying stranger, surrounded by the walls he'd built to keep them safe, William Hartwell understood something terrible. Money could open gates. It could buy security, silence, power. But it could not keep out the storm. 8 hours earlier, the city was a different kind of cold, the kind that seeps under doors and through thin walls, the kind that makes even streetlights look tired. Thomas Wheeler stood in the doorway of the boarding house, his backpack slung over one shoulder, watching his last bit of warmth fade behind him. The landlord's voice echoed down the hallway. I've been patient, kid. But 3 weeks is 3 weeks. Thomas nodded, eyes lowered. I'll find the money, Mr. Tommy. Just need a few more days. You've said that before, the man replied, not cruelly, just done caring. The door closed with a soft click that felt louder than any shout. Thomas stood there for a moment, then stepped out into the biting wind. He had 19 years behind him and $17 to his name. Everything he owned fit inside that torn backpack: 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, a toothbrush, a water bottle, 1 folded photograph of his mother, and the thin blue blanket she'd left behind when she died. He had kept it wrapped in plastic to protect it from the rain, from dirt, from the world. It was all he had left that still smelled faintly like home. The streets were half buried in snow. His breath came out in small clouds that vanished almost as soon as they formed. He turned up his collar and started walking. No destination, just movement. Moving meant staying warm. Staying alive. A block away, the neon lights of a 24-hour store glowed through the flurries. Thomas stepped toward the entrance, hoping for a few minutes of heat, maybe a cup of coffee if they didn't notice him sitting. A security guard leaned against the glass door, arms crossed. "Move along, kid," he said without looking up. The words hit harder than the wind. Thomas hesitated, then kept walking. Every door closed. Every window lit for someone else. He pressed his hands into his pockets and felt the worn edges of the photograph there. His mother was smiling in it, standing in front of their old apartment, the sunlight in her hair. He could almost hear her voice. "You'll never be poor if you still have kindness." She'd said that to him when he was 10, after giving their last dollar to a neighbor whose lights had been cut off. He hadn't understood it then. He wasn't sure he understood it now. The wind picked up, sharp and relentless. He crossed into downtown, where Christmas decorations still clung to the lampposts, mocking the night. Inside restaurants, people laughed, steam rising from bowls of soup, glasses clinking. He watched them through the windows like someone watching another life. His stomach twisted with hunger, but he turned away. The last of his cash needed to last until he found work. If he found work. The shelters were full this time of year. They always were. He'd checked earlier, too late, too crowded, too hopeless. So he kept walking. Block after block. Snow crunched under his sneakers, thin soles already soaked. He told himself he'd head toward the river, maybe find an overpass to sleep under, but his feet didn't listen. They carried him farther than he planned, past stores he could never afford, past houses with driveways so clean it looked like the snow refused to fall there. He didn't realize where he was until the air changed. The streets widened, the silence grew heavier. The lamps here glowed gold, not white. Iron gates, manicured trees, and stone walls lined both sides. Wealth had its own kind of quiet. Thomas slowed, instinctively lowering his head. He knew better than to linger in neighborhoods like this. Wrong skin, wrong clothes, wrong everything. People here saw him and reached for their phones. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets and kept walking. Then he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind, a soft, broken sound carried through the air. But as he stopped, it came again. A voice. Thin, trembling, crying. An old woman's voice. "Please. William." The sound came from an alley between 2 grand houses. He turned toward it, heart pounding. Every instinct told him to walk away. Wrong place, wrong time. But the crying continued, faint and frightened. He took a step forward, then another, peering into the darkness. And there she was, an elderly woman in a nightgown, her silver hair tangled, her bare feet red against the snow. She was holding a picture frame against her chest like it was life itself. Thomas stood frozen. The street behind him was empty. No cars, no witnesses, no one coming. For a long moment, he just stared. Then he heard his mother's voice again, softer this time, as if carried on the wind. "You'll never be poor if you still have kindness." Thomas exhaled, a cloud of breath vanishing into the night. He turned toward the woman and started walking. The alley was narrow, swallowed by shadows, the kind of place where even the wind seemed afraid to linger. Thomas hesitated at the edge, blinking against the snow that drifted sideways in the yellow light of a single street lamp. The old woman stood halfway down the path, her body trembling, her breath rising in thin white wisps. She was holding a cracked picture frame to her chest as if it were her heartbeat. The glass glinted faintly, a frozen shard of memory. Thomas's voice came out cautious, soft enough not to startle her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" The woman turned slowly. Her eyes were pale and unfocused, wandering somewhere beyond him. "William," she murmured, voice small and fragile. "My son. I have to find him. He's waiting for me at the train station. I'm late." The words hit Thomas like a gust of cold air. The train station was miles away, and this neighborhood was all mansions and gates and silence. She didn't belong out here. None of this made sense. "It's freezing, ma'am," he said gently. "Let's get you inside." But she only shook her head, clutching the frame tighter. "He'll be worried. I can't make him wait." Her slippers were soaked through. Her feet left small pink imprints on the snow. Thomas looked down the alley, then back at her. "Call 911. That's what a normal person would do. That's what safety meant." He reached for his pocket, but the motion froze halfway. Memory hit like a slap. He was 16 again, kneeling beside a drunk man who'd collapsed on the sidewalk, shaking his shoulder, calling for help. The police had arrived fast, too fast, and before he could explain, they'd had him face down on the pavement, cold metal biting his wrists. People shouting. A wallet on the ground that wasn't his. It had taken the man waking up, insisting the boy hadn't touched him, for them to finally let Thomas go. He still remembered the look in the officer's eyes. Not curiosity. Accusation. He stared at the old woman now. Her skin so pale it seemed made of paper. Her lips blue, her words tangled in time. If he called the police and they found him here, alone with a confused white woman in a nightgown, what would they see? What would they assume? The snow kept falling. The wind howled through the iron fences like a warning. He could walk away. No one would ever know he'd been here. She'd be someone else's problem, a headline, a tragedy whispered on the news. His hands shook, not from cold, but from something deeper. He looked up at the sky, at the flakes drifting down, and whispered to no one, "She could be my mother." For 3 long seconds, everything went silent, the storm, the fear, even his heartbeat. Then he took a step forward. "Okay, ma'am," he said, forcing warmth into his voice. "We'll find William together, all right? Just stay close to me." The woman blinked, confusion flickering into something like relief. "You'll help me?" "Yes, ma'am. We'll figure it out." He held out his arm, and after a moment, she placed her fragile hand in his. Her skin was ice. They started walking slowly, each step crunching through snow that came up to their ankles. She muttered names under her breath, Richard, William, home, none of them leading anywhere. Halfway down the block, her legs buckled. Thomas caught her just before she hit the ground. "Easy, easy," he said, lowering her gently against the wall of a gated estate. "You just need to rest for a second." She shook her head weakly. "I can't stop. He's waiting." Then her eyes rolled slightly, her breath hitching in shallow bursts. Panic surged through him. He looked at the house beside them, tall, silent, all its windows dark. He could see his reflection in the gate camera, a dark figure holding a woman in the snow. It looked wrong. It looked dangerous. He swallowed hard, unzipping his backpack with numb fingers. Inside was the only thing keeping him warm, his jacket. It wasn't much, thin and worn at the elbows, but it was all he had. Without thinking, he slipped it off and draped it over her shoulders. "There," he said, his teeth chattering. "That's better, right?" She stared at him, eyes suddenly clearer, more present. "You'll be cold," she whispered. "I'll be fine," he lied. "I'm tougher than I look." Her lips trembled into a faint smile. Then, slowly, her hand reached out and found his. She squeezed once, weak but certain. And in that small, wordless gesture, the world shifted. A boy with nothing had just chosen to risk everything for a stranger. The wind howled louder, snow swirling around them, but Thomas didn't move. Somewhere deep inside, fear gave way to something stronger. He'd made his choice. The night swallowed everything. The houses, the trees, even the stars disappeared behind the curtain of snow. Thomas guided Eleanor along the frozen sidewalk, one arm around her trembling shoulders, the other gripping his backpack. Her steps were slow and uncertain, her breath shallow. Every few yards, she mumbled something about William, about the train station, about being late. He just nodded, pretending to understand, pretending not to feel the ache in his own bones. The storm had grown crueler. The wind sliced through his thin sweater like knives, and his fingers had long since gone numb. He looked up, scanning for light, for movement, for any sign of life. But the street was dead, rich people's houses all locked tight, their windows glowing faintly behind layers of glass. The kind of warmth you could see but never reach. When Eleanor stumbled again, he caught her by the arms, feeling how light she was, as if the cold had hollowed her out. "Let's rest a minute," he said. She nodded weakly, too tired to argue. They stopped beside a tall stone wall, near the entrance to a massive estate. The iron gate loomed just a few feet away, frost clinging to every bar, silent and unwelcoming. But at the base of the wall, tucked into a narrow alcove, was a small metal vent pushing out a faint stream of warm air. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Here," Thomas said. "We'll sit here. Out of the wind." He helped her down, her knees stiff, her hands trembling. Then he sat beside her, pulling his backpack onto his lap. The warmth from the vent brushed against his leg, barely noticeable but enough to stop the burning in his skin. He rubbed his hands together, trying to bring life back into them. Eleanor leaned against the wall, eyes fluttering closed. "Don't sleep, okay?" he said softly. "Not yet." She opened her eyes halfway, confusion flickering across her face. "I'm just resting." Thomas reached into his bag and pulled out the thing he'd sworn he'd never use, the thin blue blanket, the one his mother had left him. The edges were frayed, the color faded, but when he unfolded it, a faint scent of soap and memory rose from the fabric. He hesitated for only a second, then wrapped it around both of them, tucking it beneath her arms. "It's not much," he said, "but it's warm." Eleanor touched the blanket, her eyes focusing for the first time that night. "This was your mother's," she said quietly. "You shouldn't waste it on me." "It's not wasted," he said. "She'd want me to use it to help someone." Her gaze softened, tears forming but freezing before they could fall. "She sounds like a good woman." "She was," Thomas whispered. "She used to say, 'Don't let the cold kill your heart before it kills your body.' I didn't understand that until now." The wind howled around them, shaking the branches overhead. For a while, neither of them spoke. Thomas watched the snow piling against the gate, the way it sparkled under the streetlight like crushed glass. His body ached with exhaustion. He flexed his fingers, but they no longer obeyed. "Tell me about William," he said, his voice low. "Your son." Eleanor's lips moved slowly, as if searching through fog. "He's a good boy. Smart. Built a company from nothing. But he works too much. Doesn't remember what matters." "What matters?" Thomas asked. "People," she whispered. "Love. Connection. That's all that lasts." Her voice drifted off, and for a terrifying moment, he thought she'd stopped breathing. But then she stirred, murmuring his name, or maybe someone else's, and leaned her head against his shoulder. The warmth from the vent barely reached them now. The air had grown sharper, heavier. Thomas looked at his watch, 1:42 a.m. He knew enough about cold to understand what came next. The shivering would stop. That was the danger, the body tricking itself into thinking it was warm. He slapped his hands against his thighs, forcing movement. "Stay awake," he said. "Talk to me, Eleanor." "About what?" "Anything." "My husband," she said faintly. "Richard. He used to play piano in the mornings. Said it made the house feel alive." Thomas smiled weakly. "My mom used to sing while she cooked. Couldn't carry a tune, but she didn't care. Said it made the food taste better. You must miss her. Every day." His voice cracked. "But she'd be mad if I gave up." Eleanor's eyes closed again. "You're freezing," she whispered. "You'll die out here." "No," he said. "We'll make it till morning." But his body betrayed the lie. His hands had gone stiff, his breath shallow. The world began to fade at the edges, colors draining into white. He felt himself slipping, sinking. Somewhere distant, he heard Eleanor's voice, soft but urgent. "Don't you leave me, son." A hand touched his face, light, trembling, alive. "Don't you dare." Her words pulled him back. He gasped, the pain flooding in like fire. He clenched his jaw, forcing his muscles to move, dragging her closer, wrapping his arms around her. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Minutes stretched into hours. Time lost meaning. The snow rose higher, blanketing them in silence. The vent's warmth was gone, replaced by the slow rhythm of two hearts fighting the inevitable. Around 5 a.m., the sky began to lighten, barely, just a gray hint on the horizon. Thomas could no longer feel his legs. His body felt far away, like it belonged to someone else. He looked at Eleanor, her face calm now, her breathing shallow but steady. "We made it," he murmured, though he wasn't sure it was true. His vision blurred. He thought of his mother, her laugh, her voice, her hands tucking him in at night. "I kept my promise, Mom," he whispered. The world tilted, soft and quiet. The last thing he saw was the snow settling gently over Eleanor's silver hair. Then everything went still. The first thing Thomas felt was warmth. Real warmth. It hurt almost as much as the cold had. His skin burned, his fingers tingled, and when he tried to move, pain shot up his arms. Somewhere close, a steady beeping marked the rhythm of his heart. He opened his eyes slowly. A white ceiling. The smell of antiseptic. A fluorescent light humming overhead. He was alive. For a long moment, he lay there, disoriented, the last images of the night flashing through his mind, the snow, the blanket, Eleanor's trembling hand, the way her voice had said, "Don't you leave me, son." His throat tightened. "Eleanor," he croaked. She's fine," a voice said gently. A nurse appeared beside him, middle-aged, kind eyes behind tired glasses. "You kept her alive, sweetheart. Your body heat prevented her core temperature from dropping too low. It's a miracle of timing." He blinked, struggling to process her words. "She's alive." The nurse nodded, smiling. "Thanks to you. You almost didn't make it yourself, but you pulled through." Thomas let out a shaky breath, something breaking loose in his chest. Relief. Gratitude. The sound of the heart monitor quickened for a moment before settling again. "How long?" he asked. "You've been out for a few hours," she said. "Just rest. The police and her family will want to talk to you when you're ready." Then she was gone, leaving him with the soft hiss of oxygen and the faint hum of the machines. The door opened again. This time, it wasn't the nurse. A man stepped in, tall, impeccably dressed, dark hair slicked back, but his eyes were red from crying. Behind him stood two officers, one male, one female. The woman spoke first, her tone calm but official. "Mr. Wheeler, I'm Detective Moore. We just have a few questions." Thomas pushed himself up slightly, wincing at the ache that spread across his ribs. "Did I do something wrong?" The man shook his head before the detective could answer. "No," he said quietly. "You saved my mother." His voice cracked on the last word. Thomas stared. "You're her son." "William Hartwell," the man said, offering a trembling hand that Thomas was too stunned to take. "I watched the footage from our security cameras. I saw you give her your jacket. I saw you wrap your arms around her." His gaze fell to the four taped to Thomas's arm. "You were dying to save her." The room fell silent. The detective stepped forward, notebook in hand. "Can you tell us what happened, Mr. Wheeler?" Thomas swallowed, the memory of the night pressing down like the cold. "I was walking," he began hoarsely. "I'd been evicted from my boarding house. Had nowhere to go. It was freezing. Then I heard someone crying between the houses. I found Mrs. Hartwell. She was barefoot, holding a picture frame, completely lost. The officers listened without interrupting. I tried to get her to come with me," Thomas continued, "but she didn't know where she lived. I thought about calling the police." He stopped, his voice fading. The detective tilted her head. "Why didn't you?" Thomas stared at the blanket draped across his legs. "Because when people see someone like me with someone like her, they don't ask questions. They assume." The words hung heavy in the air. The male officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing down. Detective Moore closed her notebook slowly. "I understand," she said quietly. "You did the right thing." William stood motionless, his hands clenched at his sides. The color had drained from his face. "My God," he whispered. "All the money I've spent trying to protect her, the cameras, the gates, the alarms, and it was all useless. You, a stranger with nothing, were the one who kept her safe." He looked down at his shoes, his voice breaking. "You saved her life while I was too busy saving my company." Thomas didn't know what to say. His throat burned. "I just couldn't leave her." Detective Moore nodded once, closing her folder. "We'll file the report that way," she said. "As an act of bravery." The male officer added quietly, "He's a hero, Mr. Hartwell." The word sounded strange to Thomas, like it belonged to someone else. William finally moved closer, his expression raw, stripped of all the confidence that came with power. He reached out, resting a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You did everything I failed to do," he said, his voice low. "You were there. You stayed." For a long moment, the only sound was the steady beep of the monitor. Then William's grip tightened slightly. "When my father died, I promised my mother I'd take care of her. I thought money would be enough. I was wrong." Thomas looked up at him, seeing not the billionaire from the magazines, but a man crushed by guilt and gratitude all at once. "You did take care of her," Thomas said softly. "You just needed someone to remind you what that really means." William's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, he let them fall. The sunlight through the hospital window caught the streaks on his face. It was the kind of light that revealed rather than hid. He looked at Thomas again, his voice a whisper. "You may have saved her life, but you also saved mine." Weeks passed, and the mansion that once seemed cold now glowed with the golden warmth of early spring. Morning light spilled across marble floors, and for the first time in years, the house smelled of life, fresh coffee, baking bread, and the faint sweetness of Eleanor Hartwell's favorite flowers arranged on every table. Thomas sat quietly at the edge of the guesthouse patio, watching his breath rise in the cool air. He still wasn't used to waking up in a real bed, with sheets that smelled like lavender instead of mildew, or hearing birds instead of sirens. Every morning felt borrowed, like a kindness too big to last. William had insisted he stay after the hospital. Until you get on your feet, he'd said. The guest house is private, comfortable. You'll be helping Mother recover. Thomas had tried to refuse, but William wouldn't hear it. So here he was, living behind a mansion that could fit his entire old neighborhood inside it. During the day, he helped Eleanor with her walks around the garden, steadying her arm as she moved slowly among the roses. Sometimes she called him William by mistake, sometimes Richard, but other times, on the rare clear mornings, she looked right at him and smiled. Thomas, she would say softly, as if testing the sound of his name. You're a good boy. He'd smile back. You say that every day, ma'am. Then it must be true, she'd answer. But the nights were harder. The silence of the estate was too deep, too clean. He'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, hearing echoes of the streets he'd come from, the rumble of buses, the hum of voices. One night, the weight of it became too much. He packed his few things, moving quietly so no one would hear. The backpack felt familiar on his shoulders again. Freedom and fear rolled together in his chest. He reached the back steps, ready to vanish into the dark. Leaving without saying goodbye. The voice was soft, shaky, but unmistakably hers. Eleanor stood at the end of the hall, framed in the warm light from her room. Her silver hair was neatly brushed, her nightgown pale blue against the shadows. I didn't want to wake anyone, he said, ashamed. You kept me alive, son, she whispered. Now let me keep you. The words stopped him cold. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then he set the bag down. Eleanor smiled faintly. Good. Now come have some tea. It's too late for running and too early for regret. So he stayed. And something shifted after that night. The house no longer felt like a museum. It breathed again. Laughter began to echo down its halls, mostly from Lily, William's 10-year-old daughter, who decided almost instantly that Thomas was her new brother. She followed him everywhere, asking 1,000 questions, showing him the library, the piano room, her mother's old art studio. When he told her he didn't know how to play, she said, "Good. Then we'll learn together." It became a rhythm. Mornings with Eleanor, afternoons studying at the library, evenings helping Lily with homework. At dinner, William would join them, still dressed in his work clothes, but his phone stayed on the counter. He listened. He laughed. He was changing too. One night, over pot roast and candlelight, he said, "I've been thinking about starting something. A foundation. For youth like you, kids who never got a fair chance. We could call it the Eleanor Hartwell Foundation." Thomas nearly dropped his fork. "You don't have to, I want to," William said firmly. "You reminded me what matters. Kindness, compassion, second chances. It's time I do something that lasts." The idea grew quickly. Within weeks, lawyers and planners came and went, but William always asked Thomas's opinion. "What should we focus on?" "Housing," Thomas said. "And education. Give them what I didn't have." William nodded. "Then that's where we'll start." For the first time, Thomas felt like he was building something that belonged to him too. He studied for his GED every morning, with Eleanor cheering him on. "You're smarter than you think," she told him. "You just needed someone to remind you." The day he passed, Lily made a paper crown for him out of gold foil and paraded him through the kitchen. William clapped him on the back. "I'm proud of you, son." It took Thomas a full minute to realize he'd said it without thinking. Summer melted into autumn. The trees around the estate turned gold, then bare. Eleanor's good days became fewer, her steps slower, her silences longer. One evening, as the first snow began to fall again, Thomas sat beside her in the library. She was wrapped in a soft shawl, her eyes half closed. "You know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I used to think my life was over. The memories fading, the loneliness, the confusion. But then you came. You reminded me that life is still worth living. Thomas swallowed hard. You reminded me too, he said. Her hand found his, frail but steady. That's how it works, Thomas. We keep each other warm. They sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling, snow tapping softly against the window panes. In another life, they would have been strangers passing on a street. But in this one, they had become family. And for the first time since his mother's death, Thomas felt something he'd almost forgotten. Home. 5 years later, the mansion was alive again. Music drifted through the tall glass windows, laughter mingled with the soft clinking of glasses, and outside, snow fell quietly over the garden where everything had begun. The Eleanor Hartwell Foundation Gala was in full swing. Donors, volunteers, and young people whose lives had been changed by its programs filled the rooms that once stood silent. The air smelled of pine and candle wax and hope. Thomas stood near the entrance hall, dressed in a simple black suit, the kind that didn't need to announce anything. On the wall beside him, a bronze plaque gleamed in the light, in memory of Eleanor Hartwell, "Home is where someone waits for you." He traced the edge of the lettering with his fingertips, a small smile tugging at his lips. It still amazed him how 5 words could hold an entire life. A voice called from behind him. "Mr. Wheeler. I mean, Director Wheeler." He turned. A boy stood nervously by the doorway, no more than 17, thin beneath a borrowed coat, eyes hollowed by exhaustion. Snow melted off his shoulders and pooled on the marble floor. "Marcus," Thomas said gently. "You made it." The boy nodded, clutching the strap of his backpack like it was armor. I didn't know where else to go. They said you help kids like me." "They said right," Thomas replied. "You're safe now. We'll figure this out together." Marcus looked up, searching his face for doubt and finding none. His shoulders relaxed for the first time in what was probably months. "Thank you," he whispered. "You don't have to thank me," Thomas said, his voice soft. "Someone once did the same for me." He gestured toward the hallway. "Come on. Let's get you something to eat." They walked past the ballroom where William was shaking hands with guests, his gray hair silver in the chandelier light. He caught Thomas's eye and smiled, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words. Across the room, photographs lined the wall, images of shelters, study centers, smiling faces. The foundation had grown beyond anything they could have imagined, but Thomas knew it all traced back to one freezing night and a choice not to walk away. Later, when the speeches were over and the music had softened to a gentle hum, Thomas stepped outside for air. The garden was blanketed in white, light strung through the trees casting a soft glow across the snow. He stood at the edge of the steps, looking out at the iron gate, the same one where he'd once held an old woman against the cold. The same gate that had nearly been his grave and his salvation all at once. "You always end up here," a voice said. Thomas turned. Lily stood in the doorway, a young woman now, confident and bright, her eyes the same clear blue as her grandmother's. "You're supposed to be inside," he teased. "You're supposed to be celebrating." She stepped beside him, wrapping her coat tighter. "I was just thinking," she said. "That night didn't just save Grandma. It saved us all." Thomas looked at her, the reflection of the lights dancing in her eyes. "You're right," he said quietly. "It changed everything." Snowflakes landed on his sleeve, melting instantly. He looked up at the sky, endless and white, and exhaled. "Kindness never dies," he said. "It just finds new hands." For a long moment, they stood together, watching the snow drift through the air like a slow benediction. Behind them, laughter rose again from the house, music swelling, the warmth of life echoing through the walls that once knew silence. Thomas thought of Eleanor, of her voice, her trembling hand holding his in the dark, of the way she'd called him son. He touched the bronze plaque once more, whispering, "We kept your promise." Then he turned back toward the light, where Marcus waited, where the next story would begin. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.